This talk is a brief discussion of the elements of the Gothic to be found in the Pardoner's Tale of Geoffrey Chaucer. It's aimed particularly at my students who are studying the AQA Lit B3 course, but should be interesting and useful for any student at just about any level, for a quick background and stimulus, if you like, to further study of this area. Before I go into the Gothic in any great detail, I just want you to look at the picture that I've put on this title page. This is Hieronymus Bosch. Now, probably painting 100 years or so after Chaucer, admittedly, around 1500 instead of 1400. But it's worth looking at this depiction of the Day of Judgment ever so quickly, just for the sheer detail of horrors that Bosch begins to find. Not only, obviously, do we have up at the top here Jesus, God, whatever, in heaven, welcoming in the pure, the bulk of the painting focuses on the sinners. And what a time these guys are having. This is no pleasant game. There's all sorts of strange implements. There's an interesting sort of mincing machine here, which Bosch is depicting as part of the punishment for hell. Sinners literally being processed and coming in alive. There's flagellations. There seems here to be some strange amount of devils tearing people apart. Heaven knows what's going on down here. But it looks as though the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah are alive and thriving in hell. And it's worth, I think, just focusing on this briefly to get an idea of the way in which the world of the medieval time differed to our own in terms of the way people saw what was around them. This was a time where death was a living thing. Death was all around. Everybody was subject to death. Nobody would escape death. And within this story, we see this clearer than almost anything else. Death lives large. So, what is the Gothic? The Gothic, it seems to me, is very clearly not part of the world of Geoffrey Chaucer. That is to say, when Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales, he was not writing, a Gothic tale. He was, however, writing a tale that is macabre, has death as a feature running throughout it, focuses on corruption, both of the soul and of the body, and has elements of the supernatural, all ideas which in the 19th century would begin to show quite clearly within Gothic writing. And it's these elements of the Gothic that, should you be writing an essay about the Pardoner in the exam, you would need to be aware of. Remembering, of course, that in Part A of the paper you are writing about the Pardoner's Tale, showing an awareness, if you like, of its potential Gothic elements. In Part B you will be applying a Gothic trope to the tale, and I hope, therefore, that this presentation is useful in relation to that. So let's start with the macabre. And I've put on this slide a few quotations just to sort of bring us ideas, if you like, about what we might focus on. So, the word macabre really has a meaning, if you like, of something particularly gruesome, but is always associated with death, one way or another. Many illustrations, many drawings, paintings from this time will feature death very clearly personified as usually a skeletal form, occasionally the beginning to be the cowled figure that will become more familiar to us through the ages. But this idea that death is always somewhere near us, and this isn't, if you like, the same conversation as we will have in a minute about the personification of death, is very important to this story. The Pardoner spends a great deal of time building up a fear of sin in his audience. That is to say, in the audience that in this sort of layered narration he is telling the pilgrims that he would usually have in villages, in other words, the illiterate and everything else. But it's worth remembering that death is always part of life at this time. There is very little sense that people would avoid death. And here, on this quotation, we'll see this here. the partner is careful, even at the end of his story, to remind, in this case the pilgrims, that death is around. It's possible, he says, that people will fall off their horse. The idea that, anything can lead to death when you least expect it. However comfortable you might appear to be, wherever you might think you are, the idea that your neck can just be snapped in two. 649.50. Death is all around us. The partner has told a tale about death. He has told a tale about people seeking death. And now here he is reminding his audience that death is around. That's not particularly gruesome, it has to be said. Certainly nothing like as bad as this quotation, where the partner is seeming to enjoy the fact that he is perfectly happy to let people die with their souls in damnation, should they not choose to buy his relics. He really doesn't care. And whilst there is this image of a blackberryhead and the little clever rhyme with berryhead and so on, and it's quite humorous, there's no doubt here that the partner is getting a degree of enjoyment out of what he is, out of how he is explaining the proximity to death that runs throughout his story, bearing in mind that the partner himself is guilty of all the sins that he is preaching about. This surely reflects somehow his state of mind, the fact that he is a man who, I don't know, in sort of a modern parlance to some degree, lives on the edge. He knows that he is damned, and he seems to get a pleasure out of talking about the damnation that awaits people should they not follow his advice. The detail with which he goes into the things that await is really only available of a man who really rather enjoys the idea that there is terrible, terrible fate about to fall. This links with the treatment, if you like, of corruption of the body particularly, and I think the image here that we have of this, there are all sorts of strong images here, but if we take this one first of all, the idea that the stomach, the body, is full of dung and corruption is a lovely yet vile image. There are worse. The man who makes of his throat his privy. This is early in the piece. This is line 241. But again, he's explaining the nature of sin, and in this case, gluttony. And he will make a link between the sin of gluttony and the fall of Adam, and therefore the fall of man. And whilst at one level we can think to ourselves, this is pushing it a bit. Eating one apple is hardly gluttony. The weight that the partner puts on the description of all that happens, the description of what happens when we eat, the care with which he talks to us about the ways between lines 252 and 60, the way that cooks prepare food to make gluttony, if you like, pleasant. This idea of the stomach filled of dung and corruption, the fact that the rioters start drunk and they never really sober up, and in fact, in the end, their death is called from a wish to drink yet more. We're reminded that the partner has called for drink before he starts his tale. This is overindulgence, and therefore sort of, if you like, corruption of the body, on a fairly grand scale, and these images of vileness that the partner produces, I think particularly this idea of the throat he maketh his privy, the idea that the throat becomes essentially the toilet, is deeply, deeply revolting. And therefore this idea of corruption of the body is very much part of the world of this poem. That can be taken a step further. When the partner is discussing oaths being sworn, he makes it very clear that all the swearing, all the oaths that one swears, tear at Christ's body. He's quite clear of this. And again, it's almost as though every time somebody swears an oath, the flesh is being torn anew off the body of Christ. Macabre, corrupting, generally revolting. When the old man appears, he is described endlessly as wasted away, as thin, as skeletal, all these ideas. Again, the idea that all around the world in which these radiatores live is corruption. Macabre, yes. Redolent of death, yes. But also corrupting both of soul and body. The whole story is about the corruption of the soul. The whole story is about how avarice is so corrosive that it can destroy the soul. And this is a feature of this writing which ties in with the Gothic very, very, very clearly. Moving on then, within all this corruption, we have an idea then perhaps of the supernatural. Now, this perhaps is hard. We will have to talk about the old man, and we'll come back to him in a moment. But before we deal with it, it's probably worth thinking about reception. Now, this is part of the assessment objectives that we have to be aware of, reception both of creation, the time of creation, and how it's perceived now. And I suppose one could argue, in terms of how things are perceived now, that everything that is in this tale to do with relics would be viewed by a 21st century audience as essentially the supernatural. I don't think there's anybody really who believes that any of these bones, or whatever they might be, thrown down a well are going to cure all known diseases. And whilst I'm not seeking to belittle the faith of those who do believe that a phial of blood, perhaps, held in the church at Hales, which is mentioned in the tale, may well be Christ's blood, I wouldn't seek to belittle that thought. These days, that will tend to be a minority view, very much. However, whilst that may be the case, there's no doubt in the 14th century that these things were believed in and were very much part of the way people lived their lives. The act of pilgrimage was an act to go and touch, in some form, a belonging, or maybe even just the tomb of the saint, in the hope of achieving, whether it be some form of salvation or cure of a disease or whatever else it might be. Many churches had their holy relic, whether it be a phial of Christ's blood, a piece of the true cross, or whatever it might be. And in this, the pardoner is not behaving in a supernatural fashion at all. He is feeding, if you like, a belief pattern that's around. One of the things that is interesting about him, even as he tells his rather inflated stories about the power of his handkerchief and so on, is that we know from the general prologue, because of the way Chaucer has set up this story, if you see what I mean, most of the pardoner's relics, well, most all, are false. We know, for example, that Virgin Mary's veil, from the general prologue, is a pillowcase. And that in his glass case he has pigges bonus. And the idea here that everything he's trying to tell us is false. Again, this idea of corruption, this idea of a corruption, in this case of the church, a corruption of the things deemed to be holy, runs throughout this tale. Now, the pardoner will certainly know that his relics are false. And he will then go on to tell us that the only thing that he is interested in, of course, is making money. He's not interested in saving people. That's a byproduct. It happens. But it's not what he is after. At the time of writing, this blasphemous behaviour, because that's what it would have been, would shock and would disgust. And it's very evident at the end of the story that that is what has happened. When the host attacks the pardoner verbally and threatens to cut off his testicles and enshrine them in a hog's turd. One of the lovely little ironies of that idea is that it's almost as though the host is offering to emasculate the pardoner, but to return him his testicles as though they themselves are relics. They're going to be enshrined. They're going to be enshrined in pig shit, as though this is all anything the pardoner carries is worth. Now, whether these beliefs are supernatural or not, difficult to say. I think certainly in a modern context, they are seen as elements of the supernatural, I think without any doubt. At the time of writing, the blasphemy that is evident throughout this tale would be far, far stronger than it is now. Which leaves us, if we think about the supernatural, with the old man, because the old man is one of those curious figures that is in this story. He is given a fairly substantial characterisation, unlike many of the types that appear, certainly the rioters, who have no characterisation whatsoever. He cannot die. He knows death. He says he's just left him in the grove. As if, well, two meanings there. He's either left him in the sense that he was speaking to him and he's now left him behind, or, of course, he's left him in the grove, almost as though he has placed death, in the shape of the gold pieces, in the grove, ready for the rioters. He certainly seems to have a relationship with death, as one of the many readings of this character. That is a supernatural idea. The idea that he has travelled the world, that he is ancient, that he cannot die, again, a definitely supernatural idea in this man. It interests, I think, that he would, in the way that the conversation runs, the implication is that he would move on and let the rioters do as they do, until they treat him rudely. And once they treat him rudely, then we are told, yes, go up the crooked way, again redolent of the path of sin. And there you will find death under a tree in the shape of these gold pieces. The old man seems to know exactly what the rioters are after, what it is that will push them over the edge into death themselves. Whether he has left death there, placed it, or whether he has met death in some form as a metaphor, very hard to say. Nevertheless, this character banging his staff on the earth, calling Leva Moda, let me in, is, I think, very definitely a very supernatural character within the context of a story that is so ordinary. We can recognise the rioters. We can recognise the rioters in 21st century Slough. We don't need to imagine what they might have been like in medieval time. We can see them on the streets. We recognise the potboy. We recognise the taverner. We recognise the host. The old man is from a different world. Hooded figure, redolent in some way of either death or a relationship with what that relationship might be. But death itself, we've talked about how the macabre idea of death and perhaps the enjoyment of of death runs through this poem, and we've talked about how the old man might have some link with death. Death itself is a hugely important part of this story. Death is personified in this tale in various ways. Early on in the story, the rioters are inquiring about the death of the corse that's drawn past them. And the response is, there came a privy thief, men clepeth death. This idea that death is a thief, the implication is here, this is a personification, this is a living thing, this is a real entity that has, and then with this lovely rhyme that we get in these couplets, in this country, all the people slayeth. Death, slayeth, rhyming together, emphasising what it is that death does. But look, all the people are being stressed here to have died in this area. And this is one of the ways that death is very much a real person. Not only is he a real person, the privy thief, we're told here that the taverner knows where death lives. This idea that death has a definite place where he might reside, if you like, in the local village where he's killed so many people. Why is this, of course? This poem is written shortly after the Black Death. It's written at a time when a huge percentage of the population of the country had been killed by a plague. The audience know death. He's a regular visitor. This makes it even clearer that when the rioters decide to go and kill death, not only, as we all know, is this impossible, but it nails on one of the huge traits of the Gothic, the Gothic literary world, that of the overweening ambition of the hero, the anti-hero. This idea of somebody striving to do something that they shouldn't. For many students, this will be best shown in Victor Frankenstein. But here we see it. The rioters, ordinary thugs, deciding that they are going to take on and defeat death. It's almost as though this ambition is one of the sins that they aren't accused of, if you like. It is perhaps their pride, the fact that they believe that they can do this. But it also sets up little resonances. It sets up little resonances such as that of Satan attacking God, being thrown out of heaven as one of the rebel angels. And this idea, I think, is what we're meant to see here, this idea that there is only one end to this. As soon as the rioters announce what they're going to do, there is only one way this is going to end. That is then finally shown to be so. This quotation here from the rioters as they set off to find death under the tree. Is it really, can it really be so dangerous to meet death? Well, yes, of course it can. But that's not what the rioters see. What the rioters see is, because they are so proud, is this potential. I'll just get rid of the writing on here. Because it is so proud to see the fact that they are going to defeat death. This rather blurred picture is another Bosch. This is Bosch's 7 Deadly Sins. And again, you can find it online, slightly clearer than this, but it's worth again having a look here at medieval representations of the sins that perhaps are being discussed within the poem. Death is never far away. Sin is something that people, if you like, did, but it's also something that they were afraid of because of where it would lead. And that is what the pardoner buys into. And that is what Chaucer so skillfully presents in this tale as, if you like, the root of the pardoner's problem. The final area I want to talk about, though, is this idea of the Gothic villain who is attractive. And we can list our Heathcliffs, our Draculas, various Gothic villains who are attractive. Even figures like the monk, deeply debauched, are only successful because they are so attractive in some way. If you remember from the monk, he's a great orator who also happens to be this foul, debauched figure, and people will flock to hear him talk, just as they will flock to hear the pardoner talk. The pardoner is proud of his speech. He has worked on it forever. He has this voice that sounds like a bell, and he has worked on this. Now, whilst there is this irony that he says that his voice sounds like a bell, and Chaucer, in the general prologue, has told us that he sounds like a goat, the fact is people listen to the pardoner. That in itself is one of his areas of attraction. Other areas of his attraction? Well, he is, it seems, according to him, something of a stud, something of a rather fine sexual operator, although again Chaucer has undercut this in the general prologue by suggesting that he's more like a gelding or a mare, which will lead us eventually to an idea that we have to consider of whether the pardoner actually is being told by Chaucer as a homosexual in this comment. He is a gelding or a mare. He is a girl in man's form. It's never really discussed, and there is a lot of critical writing. Again, you can find a lot of critical writing, mainly online, about this and whether it matters. The only reason it does matter, I think, whether the pardoner could be seen as homosexual or not, is, of course, that to a medieval audience, there could hardly be a clearer, overt sign of his impending damnation. He could do nothing to clear his soul if that were the case. Yet, within the tale, all we see is him boasting of having a lady in every town, and this bravado, and perhaps his daring, is another feature of the pardoner that people probably find attractive, certainly would have possibly found attractive. He's brave. He's so honest, he tells us exactly how evil he is, and then preaches against that same evil. There is a bravery and honesty here. How you read the very end of the tale, when he tries to sell his wares back to the pilgrims, is really up to you. But it is one of the things that I think is great about this, is that having been so clear and so honest with them, he then has almost talked himself into believing his own publicity, as it were. I think he believes that he will be able to sell, because he is so confident of himself, so brave. Nevertheless, he gets his comeuppance, and we see him slip into probably the 7th of the sins that we'll go through in the tale, into wrath, after the host's interruption, and he speaks no more. It requires the night to calm. Beyond that, is he attractive? Well, he has a woman in every town, despite clearly, according to Chaucer, being grotesque to look at, this lank hair that he has, and this general sort of air of pallid bleh. You know, this is not a handsome man. He's a vile hypocrite, he's a sinner, none of which is attractive, and yet he's honest about it, which possibly is. We also have to consider whether the wicked are more fun than the good. Certainly in terms of 19th century Gothic, this will be seen to be true. Whether it again be Heathcliff, so much stronger than any of the other men in Wuthering Heights. Paradise Lost has gone off the syllabus, but anybody who's read the first books of Paradise Lost cannot fail to be engaged by Satan as a wonderfully interesting character. God gets very little coverage of any worth in those books. Somehow the wicked are often the more interesting. And again, that might be another reason that the pardoner could be attractive. Certainly, the villains within his story, if you like, i.e. the rioters, have no attractive qualities whatsoever. They are deeply vile, damned from beginning to end, brutish, rude, aggressive, drunk. They certainly do not fit this bill. But we have to remember, as we read the pardoner's tale, that we're reading a tale within a tale. Whilst the pardoner tells us his story, it is Chaucer who is telling us the pardoner's tale. Thus, if the pardoner is seen to be, in some ways, attractive, that is Chaucer's work. He has created a villainous character, one of the few deeply unpleasant characters within the Canterbury Tales, and yet one with whom, even if we don't sympathise, we might well almost smile and chuckle at the bravado, at the honesty, in the same way as we might with a character, a much more developed character from 200 or 300 years later, such as Iago. So, I hope that within this conversation there have been elements here for you to get hold of in terms of trying to think where the Gothic is found. The work starts now, as always, and if you go back through the slides of this presentation, what you would actually need to do is to start to list carefully moments within the tale where we see any of the elements I've been talking about appearing clearly in front of us. Stack up your short quotations. But begin to see how elements of the Gothic, under the headings that perhaps I've laid out here, appear within this story. Thank you for listening.